Good morning, everybody. It is Wellness Wednesday. Today is February 21st. I'm super excited to be here with each and every one of you. And today I have a specific question that was asked of me that I wanted to cover with you. And so here's the question, and I'll copy and paste this right into the chat box. It's already in the Facebook group. The question is, let me paste this. How do you help individuals identify their strengths and weaknesses and leverage them to enhance performance? This is a really good question. How do you help individuals identify their strengths and weaknesses and leverage them to enhance performance? Well, number one, I am a big believer in doubling down on strengths versus making up for weaknesses. In fact, one of the things that I've mentioned over the course of my career is that I feel that we should help people find their strength zone, but stay out of their comfort zone. And what I mean by that is that they continuously are growing. I think that I define growth as the intentional and continuous expansion of your comfort zone. It is the intentional and continuous expansion of your comfort zone. And so what I mean by that, for example, I'm very introverted, and I was brought up in business by somebody who's very extroverted. And when she was teaching me how to build the business, she was teaching me to do it through the methods that she was familiar with, which was public networking, going out, shaking hands, kissing babies, which I honestly would rather screw my toes to the floor than do that. And I'll never forget sitting there in an event with her one time. And she looked over at me and she said, "You're miserable." And I said, "Yeah, I hate this." And she said, "Why don't you leave?" And I said, "Because you asked me to be here." And she said, "Well, I can see that this isn't working for you, so why don't you go ahead and go?" And it was in that moment that I realized that I had to build the business the way that I knew how, which for me is primarily through picking up the phone and relentlessly calling people. I was good at that. I was willing to do it. It was in my strength zone, and yet it was out of my comfort zone. And so I think that each and every one of us should be looking at the different areas of our lives and understanding kind of our own nature and nurture, and doing things in a way that are within that God-given strength zone. But how do you figure out what that is for you? And so what I like to figure out first is where are you already showing great strength? So the question is, if I'm attempting to figure out somebody's strength zone, where do you in your life, what areas in your life do you already elicit great strength? Meaning you show up with strength. And so that's going to take me to one of my all-time favorite questions. I call it the Hunger Game question. And I'll say this slowly, and if Madison or Laura, you guys can type this out and put it in the chat box. But tell me about a time that you wanted something. I mean, you wanted it bad. Tell me about a time that you wanted something. I mean, you wanted it bad. And you had no earthly idea how you were going to get it. You had no earthly idea how you were going to get it. In fact, it seemed impossible. In fact, it seemed impossible. And yet you knew in your heart you would, and you did. And yet you knew in your heart you would, and you did. So what I'm looking for here, as I mentioned, is where have you already shown great strength? Where have you already shown character? And I'll never forget when I first came across this question, the way that I answered it was I had a good friend that had passed away, unfortunately, on a mountain in an accident. He and I went preschool through senior year together. Our families were very close, and it was a really misfortunate accident. And when we got to our 10-year reunion, we wanted to do something to honor him, to remember him and who he was. And he was a very special individual. I mean, he died when he was, I think we were 21 at the time, maybe 22. And there were 750 people at his funeral. I mean, he was just a special guy. So we wanted to honor him, and we wanted to do it in the spirit of who he was. And so we decided that we were going to build a treehouse in the local park where I grew up. And that treehouse we wanted to be very special. So we found this company out in California who made them, and they would ship them in, and then we would assemble it. And it was $25,000 for all of it. And at this point in my life, I didn't have two nickels to rub together. But I knew in my heart that I was going to make this happen. I knew that it was going to happen. And I think that when we think about looking at strength, there's one of two energies that we approach life or goals, visions, whatever you want to call it with. There's the energy of longing, and then there's the energy of knowing. So the energy of longing it has a specific language. It's, I hope, oh man, that would be so great. It would be so nice. The energy of knowing it's just a matter of time. I know in my heart that this will come to pass. It's not a matter of if, it's when. So I had great energy of knowing. I just knew in this like fiber of my being. And I believe in this idea of first creation, second creation. We create everything first in our imagination. And whatever is consistently held with great clarity in the imagination will eventually seek physical expression. Whatever is consistently held in the imagination. And look, your imagination is amoral, good or bad. It's just like Google, right? You can go to Google and type in, show me the cutest puppy in the world, which is something my daughters really love to do. There's some very cute puppies out there. Or you can type in, war, images of violence, whatever. Google does not care. It's amoral. It's going to just show you whatever you search for. So whatever you consistently hold in your imagination, it will seek physical expression. And that's why I share with people that your imagination is like a 3D printer. Whatever you design there and hold there over time, it will eventually show up. In fact, I was having this conversation with a friend of mine. I was speaking to a group of his managers a few weeks ago. His name is James. And James was telling me that he just believes in this process of manifestation. This is a very successful person, both privately, publicly, professionally. And he said what he does is anytime he wants to achieve something, he just writes it down and puts it somewhere where he'll see it all the time. And he just has this energy of knowing. I also call it the energy of done. I'm just going to exist as if this thing has already come to pass. And it's the reason why I wrote the quote, and I believe it to be true, that a properly trained imagination will make the realization of your vision. And when I say vision, think goals, wants, whatever it is. It'll make the realization of your vision feel like deja vu. When we built that treehouse for Chris, I wasn't surprised. I'd already been there. I knew this was going to happen. I knew it in my heart. So when we talk about eliciting strengths and we talk about helping people get into performance, where do they already show great strength? Because when I unpack how we answer that question of telling me about a time that you knew in your heart, what you've shared with me is what's really important to you. It's when you have awakened latent forces of potential. And see, unfortunately, by the way, latent, that word is one that gets misunderstood. It's hidden or dormant. Unfortunately, most people only find what they're really capable of in emergency situations. It's when they're backed into the corner. And you've all probably heard, stories of this. One in particular that I've shared here in this group before is this man driving down the road. This was in the scientific journal. He's driving down the road, looks over and sees this car that has sparks flying out from underneath it. And he's like looking at it, trying to figure out what's going on. And he notices that there's a bicycle stuck under the car. And eventually they stop and he looks under that car and there's a person stuck between the bike and the car. So they get the person that's driving the car to, stop, and he gets out and he lifts the end of this car up. It was like a Chevy Camaro, it's 3,500 pounds. They call that hysterical strength. Hysterical strength. And see, many of you have this hysterical strength. You've got this potential that is within you. And yet we don't know how to activate it unless there is particular circumstances that show up in our lives. We're backed into a corner. It's an emergency situation. And what I'm endlessly fascinated with is how do we activate those forces from a place of, from a place of health and power? Why does it always have to be through pathology? Why does it have to be when something bad happens? So if we're eliciting strengths, we're looking for, where does this person activate their latent forces of potential? Where did they show up with great strengths already? That's what I want to understand. And that question will tell me, because it'll tell you what is important to you. And in the example of my friend, it wasn't about me. It was about him. It was about honoring his memory in a way that was important to us and to his family. Now, another thing that I like to, I think sometimes that word strength can be a word that misleads people. Maybe it's been overused. And there's other words in the coaching language that do the same thing. Accountability is one. I think discipline is another word that gets misunderstood. And so sometimes instead of strength, I just like to take out strength and ask the question of like, what's your superpower, right? And here's a really great question that you can ask. Like, if I were going to create a Marvel movie about you, what would be the superpower of that character? And it doesn't have to be something physical. It might be a mental superpower. If I were going to create a Marvel movie about you, a comic book movie about you, what would we show up, or what would show up as that of the superpower in that movie, or the character in that movie? Now, sometimes when it comes to our own strengths and superpowers, the law of familiarity gets in our way. And what I mean by that is sometimes we discount our own strengths and superpowers because we are so familiar with them. And when we get familiar with things, you think everybody possesses these strengths, everybody possesses these superpowers, and it's just not true. I shared this story yesterday. I have a lady that helps us meal prep and make meals for us, and it's one of the blessings that we have. And the way that she cooks is just amazing. I mean, it is absolutely out of this world. And I share with her, like, Maggie, this is unreal. And to her, though, it's like, oh, it's just okay. It's not that great. And it's like, no, this is world class. Like, this is so good. But to her, she's so familiar with it. It's not a superpower. It's not a strength. And it's kind of like a magician doesn't get impressed by the rabbit coming out of the hat because he's familiar with how it came out. He knows the illusion. And so I share that as just a word of encouragement. Don't overestimate the world and underestimate yourself. You're better than you give yourself credit for. And the strengths and superpowers that you have, you discount them because you can see the illusion behind them. And you think that just because you possess them, everybody does. And it's just not true. The last thing that I'll say is, as it relates to strengths, is what have you been programmed for? So if you think about it like this, a vacuum is a terrible lawnmower because a vacuum has not been built and programmed to cut grass, right? And if you could imagine trying to go outside and mow your grass with a vacuum, you wouldn't get very far. And so we all have been programmed, both from a pre-programming perspective. All of us came pre-programmed with certain genetic tendencies. I'm left-handed, for example. That's a great example. I've always been blessed to, if you give me a series of numbers, I will find the pattern in them. And I didn't teach myself that. That's just a gift that I was born with. And yet, on the other hand, growing up, we were programmed by our environment. And your environment was made up of a lot of different ingredients. Your parents, certain religious structures, voices of authorities, teachers, your school, peers, things of that nature. You were programmed as a kid. And I'm endlessly fascinated in that, digging in and figuring out who and how have you been programmed? How did you become the person that you are? Because in there, if you were actually meant to be a lawnmower, but you were programmed as a vacuum, well, then you're acting in a lot of ways that can be considered weak because of a belief system that you've installed along the way. And so I feel like it's on coaches to hold up the mirror and make the unconscious conscious and help people understand, how did you become who you are today? How did the environment influence you into believing certain things? And your belief is what creates behavior. Behavior is what creates habit. So a behavior repeated over time gets automated into habit. And so when we're thinking about this strengths and weaknesses conversation, how did you become who you are? Who programmed you? How did you get to this point? And, I think of it like it's your own personal history channel. Like if you were watching the History Channel, but it's you, right? Um, that's a great place to go back and start figuring out strengths and weaknesses. And there's so much there. It's so rich. I mean, there's some people that grew up in very healthy environments with very supportive parents that were aware and paying attention. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people out there that grew up with very unpredictable parents, and parents that unfortunately were abusive. And we wonder why these people struggle with anxiety. It's because their fight or flight system kicks on constantly because they grew up with an unpredictable adult who's bigger than them, and they have to constantly monitor and watch what's happening because they fear for their own safety. And see, inside of My Freed Life, one of the principles that we really believe in is this idea of self-leadership, that you lead yourself first, and that the leading of others should be a reflection of your example, how you lead yourself. That is the best, purest type of leadership. And you can only lead something to the degree that you understand it. Said another way, it's really hard to lead something you don't understand. And I know, like, because I've been doing this long enough right now, that the majority of you don't understand how you became who you are. And then you get into resistance to the self-sabotaging behaviors that were installed along the way. And that makes the change process 10 times harder than it has to be. And what I mean by this, and we've all had this this happen. Have you ever been attempting to walk out of a building and you're pushing on a door that meant to be pulled? And that's what I know about most of you and how you approach change. You're pushing when what you should do is pull, and the door will open right up. And yet you have to go on the journey to figure out, how did I become who I am? How did I end up here? And through that journey, we can elicit your strengths. We can figure out the things that will lead to greater performance. So there you have it, everyone. If you really want to know how to help people get into bigger performance. Number one, where do they already show great strength? Where have they shown a track record of great strength, right? Through that question. And if I was going to make a movie about you, what would I show as the superpower of your character, of the person playing the movie? And then lastly, how did you become who you are? What have you been programmed for? Are you a vacuum out there trying to mow the lawn? Are you pushing when you should be pulling? So I would encourage you to try all this on for size, see how it fits. And as always, if there's anything that my team can do for you, feel free to reach out. We so appreciate you being here today and trust that you're going to take this and make this one of the best weeks of your life. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and live freedom. Bye-bye.